Welcome once again, my friends, and thank you for stopping by to listen to an old storyteller. Today we have a story from Hungary, and the title of this story is The Fortunate Student. There was once a poor student who set off during the vacation to go walking about the country, for he was growing tired of book learning and thought he would like to read a while in the great book of nature for a change. And one day, as he was walking through a field, he saw on the ground a quantity of peas, which had lain there so long that they were all dried up and cracked. But the young student had been blessed with a father who was a careful and provident man, and he had, therefore, been taught never to throw anything away, no matter of how little value it might seem to be. So he picked up the peas carefully, put them in his pocket, and continued on his journey. Just as night was falling, he came to the place where the king of the country lived. So he went to the king's palace and inquired whether he could have a night's shelter and a little money to help him on his way. This was by no means an unusual thing for a student to do. People were glad to give a helping hand to a young fellow who had his way to make in life. But it so happened that the queen had occasion to pass through the room in which he was being interviewed by the steward, and she was struck by the young man's handsome appearance, by his pleasant voice, and his easy, courteous manners. I shouldn't wonder, she thought to herself, for she was a romantically minded lady, I shouldn't wonder if he is a prince in disguise, traveling about the country in search of a wife. The more she pondered over this, the more certain she became that it was so, and, as she happened to have a marriageable daughter, she very soon went so far as to persuade herself that fate had ordained that this young prince was the man whom the princess should wed. She told all this to her husband, the king, and he, being also romantic, possibly he had caught it from his wife, entirely agreed with her. However, they decided to take all proper precautions. So, without saying anything further, they told the steward to ask the young man to spend 2 nights in the palace, and then laid their plans accordingly. They commanded that the bed on which he was to sleep should be rather hard and uncomfortable. Now, everyone knows that a real, true prince cannot sleep at all in an uncomfortable bed, whereas poor students have to put up with whatever is given them. So they felt that if their visitor slept well on the hard bed, it would be a positive proof that they were mistaken and that he was not a prince at all. The bed was made up in one of the rooms of an outbuilding in the grounds of the palace, and a trustworthy servant of the king was ordered to stand concealed outside the window and to look in and see what took place. The young man was given some supper and then shown to his room. He was tired after his journey and began to undress at once. But as he threw off his coat, the peas, which were loose in one of his pockets, dropped out and fell upon the floor, many of them rolling under the bed. Thereupon the student, mindful of his father's teaching, began searching for them and could not rest until he had found every single one. For hours he went on groping about for the scattered peas, and it was not until dawn began to break that he at last lay down in bed. The man who was watching outside the window could not make out exactly what he was doing, but he was able to see that the young student did not get to sleep until dawn, and this he reported next morning to the king and queen. They felt that this was very satisfactory indeed, and sent a message to the student to say that they would be very pleased if he would join them at breakfast. He accepted with pleasure, feeling that it was really most polite and kind of them. "How did you sleep?" asked the queen pleasantly. "Not too well," replied the young man, "but I have only myself to blame for that." The king and queen exchanged glances when he made this remark, for they felt quite sure that the young man regretted that he had not told them his true rank, and in that case he would have been given a more comfortable bed. They were by now convinced that he was indeed a prince in disguise, and thenceforward treated him as they felt befitted his noble birth. The next night he slept in the same room, but the bed was a different one. This time it was the best the palace could afford, with pillows of finest down and the softest of mattresses. Once again the trusted servant was posted by the window, and this time he gave a very different report. The young man had slept soundly, he said, throughout the night. He had not moved so much as an eyelid. This was, of course, not to be wondered at, considering how tired he must have been after his lack of sleep the previous night. As for the peas, he had tied them up carefully in a corner of his handkerchief, so that there should be no chance of their falling on the floor again. The king and queen, being now quite satisfied that the young man was truly a prince in disguise, made much of him, treated him like royalty, and introduced him to their lovely daughter. The student fell in love with her on the spot, and never attempted to tell them that he was only a poor student, and that he possessed nothing in the world but the clothes he stood up in and a handful of dried peas. After all, they asked him no questions, so that he had no need to tell them any lies. If they chose to look upon him as a prince, that was their own affair, and he might as well take the good gifts that fortune offered him. So he married the princess, who was a most charming and beautiful girl, and very fond of him, and was persuaded to stay on at the palace, at any rate for 1 year, so that the king and queen might not feel that they were losing their only daughter too suddenly. But at the end of the year, the king said he thought it was about time that their son-in-law returned to his own home in his own kingdom. He was now in a very awkward position, for how could he take his wife to a kingdom which did not exist, and to a home which he did not possess? It was all very worrying for the poor young man, but he was fortunately of a happy-go-lucky disposition, and decided that he had better say nothing and go through with the matter, trusting that fate, which had so far befriended him, would continue to do so in the same wonderful way. After all, should things turn out badly, he could always make his escape and go back to the university, for he had taken the precaution not to throw away his cap and gown. So he set off with his wife and a fine retinue of servants such as befitted a prince. But he grew more and more nervous as they rode along, and when at last they came to a great forest, he slipped quietly away and concealed himself in a deep ditch, where he started to undress so that he might change into his student's cap and gown, which he had with him in a bundle, and so get away without being noticed. But all of a sudden he perceived close to him a great dragon, which had been lying asleep under the fern growing in the ditch, and had now been awakened by his movements. The young man was rather alarmed, but he remained quite still, feeling that that was the wisest thing to do. The dragon looked at him drowsily with a few of its eyes, for it had 7 heads, and then asked him who he was and what he was doing there. As it seemed to be quite a friendly creature, the young man poured forth his tale, adding at the end that he had come to a point where the only thing left for him to do was to run away, much though he hated leaving his charming wife and the many pleasant things which the adventure had brought him. The dragon opened a few more of its eyes and looked at him again. "There is no need for you to run away," it said. "It would be a great pity to do that. Go back to your wife and continue your journey. When you come to the edge of the forest, you will see before you a great castle, all made of copper, perched on the top of a goose's egg in such a way that it can turn round and round. That castle belongs to me, and for the present I will lend it to you. But when the castle begins to turn about, you must leave at once, for that will be a sign that I am coming back, and should I find you there on my return, that will be the end of you." The student was overjoyed at his good fortune, thanked the dragon warmly for its kindness, and quickly rejoined his wife and train, rode on with them through the forest without having been missed by anyone. And as they drew near to the edge of the trees, there, sure enough, they saw a splendid copper castle right in front of them, shining in the sun. "Here's the end of our journey," said the student, and they all rode up to the castle and entered the great gate. Crowds of liveried servants came running forward to receive them, and they found the whole place beautifully furnished with every comfort and luxury the heart could desire. The student lived there very happily with his wife for the space of 2 years. He really began to feel as though he were indeed a great prince, and had almost forgotten about the dragon to whom the place belonged. But one day the castle suddenly began to turn, slowly at first, but gradually more and more quickly, so that before long it was fairly whizzing around. When this happened, the young man was naturally much distressed, and he went up onto the highest battlements and there wandered about in great grief, wondering what he should do now, for it certainly looked as though his good luck had failed him at last. But through the window of a room situated in the very topmost turret, he saw an old woman, with a face as wrinkled as a withered apple. He opened the door of the room and went in. "Good morning, Granny," he said politely. The old woman looked at him with her sharp eyes, which were marvelously bright for such an old woman. "What ails your Majesty?" she asked. The student thought he might as well tell her, for she had a shrewd and kindly face. "What ails me, Granny, is this. Everybody believes me to be a great prince, whereas I am truly nothing of the kind." And he told her all his story. "There is no need for you to be troubled about that," said the old woman when he had finished. "But it is well for you that you have told me the truth, for I would have you know that I am the Queen of Magic, and the dragon with 7 heads is my bitterest enemy. Listen attentively to me, and I will tell you what you must do. If you follow my instructions faithfully, you will have nothing to fear." She then told him to have a loaf of bread made and to have it baked in the oven 7 times, together with other loaves, but to see that this particular loaf was always put into the oven first of all and taken out last. And when all this was completed, he was to keep the loaf until the next day, and then put it on the ground in front of the castle entrance. "When the dragon comes," she said, "the magic loaf will be so powerful that the dragon will be conquered by it and will never come here again to trouble you." The young man thanked the old woman warmly and undertook to do everything just as she had advised. By the time the loaf had been prepared according to her instructions, the night had fallen. But very soon after midnight it was placed just outside the gate. Just as dawn was breaking, the dragon came flying up to the castle, breathing out great flames in the fresh morning air. But when it alighted in front of the entrance, the loaf began to speak. "Stop! I am on guard here," it said. "You cannot enter here without my permission, and I will not give you that permission until you have suffered what I have suffered." "Indeed," said the dragon, "and what have you suffered, pray?" But though it spoke so confidently, it felt anxious, for it was well aware that it would have to obey, because of the loaf's magic powers, which were far stronger than its own. Then the loaf related how first of all it had been a seed buried in the cold, dark earth, how it had softened, sprouted, and grown up towards the air and daylight, how it had been beaten by the hail and half drowned by the rain, how it had shivered in the cold wind and had been scorched by the burning rays of the sun, and had at last been cut down by sharp blades, tied up with harsh string, threshed with a flail, ground by a stone, kneaded into dough, then baked in an oven longer than any of its companions. "If you can stand all those things," it said at the end, "I will let you into the castle, but if not, you will have to remain outside." The dragon knew perfectly well that it could not possibly endure all these things, and it flew into such a fearful rage that it burst. And so the student was left in possession of the castle and everything that was in it, servants, furniture, and great bags of gold and silver in the cellars, enough to keep them all to the end of their days. But he was both kind and wise, and fortunately was not at all spoiled by his good fortune, so that he lived happily with his wife and looked well after his people. And later on, when the father and mother of the princess died, they left their kingdom to him, and he ruled over it in their stead, as well as over his own lands. "And if I thought I might fare as well as that student," said the narrator of this story, "I would go to college this very minute." Thank you once again for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this story, please press that like button. Also, please help an old storyteller out by subscribing to my channel. The next story will be posted in a few days, so until then, may your story continue to be a good one.